There are basically two facts about Colombia that I think we should bear in mind. The rest is all footnotes. The first fact is what you've just been hearing. It has a horrendous human rights record. Right now it wins first prize in the hemisphere, which is not an easy prize to win. The political killings, as you heard, are somewhere variously estimated at 5 to 10 a day, mostly state security forces. The second fact is that Colombia receives more than half of U.S. military aid for the hemisphere. That when Bill Clinton came in, he was going to change that, and he did. He increased it by about 12%. When the Pentagon budget was not ample to deal with the increase, he turned to emergency overdrawing facilities available to the president, pretty much as in the case of the recent bailout of investors in Mexico. Crimes in Colombia have been pretty awful through the 80s. They've been increasing. They got worse under the most recent president, Cesar Gaviria. He was a special friend of the United States, in particular Bill Clinton, who liked him so much that he rammed him through as Secretary General of the OAS with a power play that was pretty much resented in the hemisphere. The State Department, in affirming their support for President Gaviria, praised him particularly for his steps towards extending democracy in Colombia under very difficult conditions. That the conditions are difficult is not in doubt. I think you can ask the several thousand murdered people of the one opposition party, though were they around, would be glad to tell you about it. And President Gaviria helped substantially in creating and expanding these conditions, so the support for him made a lot of sense. Now, there's absolutely nothing new or out of the general pattern in this correlation between the most horrendous human rights record and the largest U.S. contribution, in this case, literally more than half the military aid for the hemisphere. In fact, that's a standard correlation. It's been shown over and over. There was an important study of it by the leading academic specialist on human rights in Latin America, a very mainstream scholar, Lars Schultz, University of North Carolina, did a study in an academic journal, was published in 1980, in which he simply compared U.S. foreign aid in Latin America with torture in Latin America, and found that they were remarkably well correlated. As he put it, U.S. aid flows primarily to the worst human right, to countries that torture their citizens, to the most egregious violators of human rights in the hemisphere. This continued right through the Carter years, no change. It included military aid, and as he was careful to point out, it was uncorrelated with need. It was not that the countries that torture happened to be the most needy. In fact, there was no correlation at all. Well, that might lead a superficial observer to conclude that the United States just likes torture, but you're all scientists and you know that you can't deduce causality from a correlation. And in fact, another study was done at the same time that sheds further light on it. This was done by an economist at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, a long-time colleague and co-author and friend of mine, Edward Herman, and we published it in a joint book about the same time. Herman did a broader global study of the correlation between human rights and between torture and foreign aid. Incidentally, the reason why torture is picked is because Amnesty International does an extensive survey of torture. They are an important organization, but they have a very specific mandate that they keep to, and one of the things is torture, so there's a pretty good record of torture. And he found that across the world, the same correlation held. there's a very close correlation between torture and U.S. aid. In fact, he concluded quite realistically that Washington is the torture capital of the world if you trace back torture to its source. I don't think any statement we published in that book has aroused so much fury, but I'm afraid it's true. The correlation was global. But Herman also did a second study, which shed some light on it. He compared U.S. aid with the climate for business operations in a country, as measured by ability to repatriate profits and so on. And he found that foreign aid was very closely correlated to the climate for business operations, the investment climate. Now that correlation makes sense. The purpose of foreign aid, after all, is for the U.S. taxpayer to pay off U.S. corporations via some other country. And therefore, which is what foreign aid in fact amounts to overwhelmingly, and like most social policy, and the fact that foreign aid increases as the climate for business operations increases, of course, is completely natural, in fact, almost automatic, as people would know if there was such a subject as international relations or political science or government, where you study the things that go on in the world. In fact, it's almost a truism. Now, why should there be a correlation between U.S. aid and torture? Well, that's a secondary correlation. There happens to be a very good reason why improving the climate for business operations is associated with torture. One of the best ways of improving the climate for business operations is to murder union leaders, torture priests and nuns who are trying to organize peasants, kill human rights activists, and so on. That has a marvelous way of improving the climate for business operations. It's one of the main things that contributes to what are called economic miracles in another department down the street. So naturally, you have a correlate, so that's a reasonable correlation too, and if you put those two reasonable correlations together, you just happen to find by accident a secondary correlation between U.S. aid and torture. So the proper conclusion is not that U.S. leaders kind of enjoy torture, it's that it's a matter of total indifference. What they care about is profits for U.S. investors, and it just happens that that's correlated with torture, a global phenomenon and a perfectly understandable one. Actually, it's broader than that. In the case of Colombia, illustrates it. It's an important feature of maintaining a favorable climate for business operations. An important feature of it is creating a society that has formal democracy with ample oppression. And to maintain formal democracy with oppression does require plenty of torture and killing and social cleansing and other things. And to maintain an economic system of extraordinary injustice of the kind you just heard described, where half the children are hungry, for example, and so on, that requires harsh measures, and that's what security forces are for. Well, all of this is completely familiar to anybody who looks around the world. In the case of Colombia, it was explained quite clearly some time ago by the president of the Colombian Permanent Committee on Human Rights, Alfredo Vázquez Carrizosa. He pointed out, I'll just quote his description, he said that Colombia is a wonderful democracy, not only since 1991, but I think 1886 or something like that, whenever the first constitution was. Really nice. Almost as nice a democracy as the Soviet Union under Stalin, which also had quite a beautiful constitution. He says that behind the facade of a constitutional regime, we have a militarized society which has been under a state of siege virtually constantly. There is, for example, land reform legislation, plenty of land. And incidentally, I should say Colombia is quite a rich society. It's not that it's a poor, impoverished society. It has enormous wealth, mineral wealth, oil resources, agricultural resources, even had the beginnings of industrial development. And in fact, it's not impossible that it might have had an industrial revolution if it hadn't been under the leadership of business classes who were more or less committed to free market policies. And one of the sort of small secrets about economic development, very well established over several centuries, is that free market policies are a recipe for total disaster. Part of the reason why the first world is first world and the third world is third world, although they were more or less alike back in the 18th century, is that the first world, without exception, the United States is the most extreme example, but it's true of everyone else, followed extreme protectionist policies and still does. Whereas what we call the third world pretty much followed free market policies because it was rammed down their throats. And the difference is notable, and whatever possibilities there were for an industrial revolution in Colombia, which were not slight, given its resources and its population and everything else, they were essentially aborted by the fact that they follow the rules that they teach you about in the IMF and the World Bank and so on. And it's not the only case. In fact, it's remarkably uniform. Also well known to economic historians, I should say. So Colombia is a rich country, but a very poor one for most of the population. It had land is a big problem. Not that there's a shortage of it, but it's owned by, a very tiny number of people. And there is land reform legislation. It's been on the books since 1961, but it simply isn't implemented. The reason it isn't implemented is the country is run by the landowners and the army who work for them, and who are paid by you and me. That's where our taxpayer money goes to. That is well known as well. In fact, this present system was pretty well established by the Kennedy administration, which among its innumerable crimes, which were quite remarkable, and that's something that might interest us around here since it was a Cambridge-based administration, right from the elite universities, Harvard and MIT, and following all the right rules that people design and invent and teach here. The Kennedy administration in 1962 instituted a change in hemispheric policy, which is one of the most important things that ever happened in the entire history of the hemisphere, and would be well known if we were to study things like history and so on. In 1962, the Kennedy administration shifted the policy of the Latin American military, and of course we're in a position to do that. They changed the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense, as it was called, to internal security. Well, hemispheric defense was kind of a holdover from the Second World War, when you had to worry about the Germans and stuff. And it didn't mean anything. The only threat to anyone in the hemisphere was in Washington, and that's not what they were being paid to defend themselves from. But internal security isn't a joke. Internal security is just a code word that means war against the population. And that shift from hemispheric defense to internal security, which was implemented in planning, in training officers, in equipment, and so on, that led to a very substantial change. In fact, it set off a horrifying plague of repression throughout the hemisphere, worse than anything in its quite bloody history. And that's well known, too. So, for example, some years later, the man who was in charge of counterinsurgency for the Kennedy and the early Johnson administrations, Charles Machling, he described what happened pretty clearly and accurately. He said this change in 1962, this change in the Latin American military, made a change from U.S. toleration of the rapacity and cruelty of the Latin American military to direct U.S. government complicity in the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads. That's pretty accurate. And in fact, the reference to Himmler's extermination squads is also accurate. There's quite a good study done by one of the main researchers of Amnesty International, Michael McClintock, 2-volume study. We actually did a study called Instruments of Statecraft. It's the third of a 3-volume study, in which he simply looked into the background of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, the kind that was taught to the Colombian military, and indeed it goes straight back to the Nazis. After the Second World War, Wehrmacht generals and specialists were brought to the United States, and they showed how it was done, and the early Army training manuals, in fact, are not only modeled on, but mimic Nazi manuals during the Second World War, in which they study how you control the enemy being the partisans, and the good guys being the Nazis, and so on. It's quite literally true. And it comes right on into the neo-Nazi states that were established throughout the hemisphere, primarily by the Kennedy administration and its followers. So Maechling's reference to the methods of Heinrich Himmler's extermination squads is not simply a metaphor. Well, that was also understood well by the Kennedy intellectuals. For example, in internal communications, now declassified, between Robert McNamara, Kennedy's main Vietnam War advisor, and McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor, who's former Harvard dean. McNamara pointed out to Bundy that the military training that had been provided to Latin American officers, this was in 1965, so after a couple of years, the U.S. military training provided the Latin American officers with the understanding of an orientation toward U.S. objectives. And he says that was quite important because in the Latin American political culture, the Latin American military must be prepared to remove government leaders from office whenever, in the judgment of the military, the conduct of these leaders is injurious to the welfare of the nation. He didn't bother saying which nation, but since they had been trained in the understanding of an orientation towards U.S. objectives, I guess it really didn't matter which nation he had in mind. He was doubtless thinking specifically of the greatest achievement of the Kennedy administration in foreign policy, namely the military coup in Brazil, which had just taken place, called the greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century by Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, who then went on to become president of Johns Hopkins University. It's all in the family, you know. This greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century was a military coup which overthrew the parliamentary regime, which was getting out of line, and instituted the first of the neo-Nazi national security states of Latin America. And Brazil is a big place, so it had a domino effect, and pretty soon it was spreading all over the place. Well, the generals there had an understanding of an orientation toward U.S. objectives, so pretty soon we had a wave of torture and murder and massacre and an economic miracle. Investors were doing very nicely. Foreign investors, about maybe 5% of Brazilians were doing very, very nicely, in fact, living beyond anything that we can dream about, and most of the rest were kind of sinking into the state of Central Africa, but that's the definition of an economic miracle. If you look around the world, that's what it is, including Mexico, where we've just seen the most recent one. Also called an economic miracle until December 19th, 1994. In Colombia, this had its effects as well, continuing with Vázquez Carrizosa's remarks. In the 1960s, he points out, the violence in Colombia was exacerbated by external factors. The Kennedy administration turned the army into counterinsurgency brigades, accepting the new strategy of the death squads, ushering in what is known in Latin America as the national security doctrine, the right to combat the internal enemy as set forth in the Brazilian doctrine, the Argentine doctrine, the Uruguayan doctrine, and the Colombian doctrine. It is the right to exterminate social workers, trade unionists, men and women who are not supportive of the establishment, human rights activists, and so on, by torture, assassination, mass murder, and disappearance, which the military learn once they are given the understanding of an orientation towards U.S. objectives and follow the training that they pick up in the School of the Americas and use the arms that you and I pay for. Well, The official doctrine, I might as well read you the way the Colombian military sees it. The Colombian Minister of Defense in 1989 described the official apparatus of terror. He says it's an apparatus designed for total war by state power in the political, economic, and social arenas, I'm quoting. Now, officially, of course, the targets are the guerrilla organizations, but a high military official explained in 1987 that the guerrilla organizations were of minor importance, as you just heard. But this is now a military officer, not a human rights lawyer speaking. He said the real danger is what the insurgents have called the political and psychological war, the war to control the popular elements and to manipulate the masses. The subversives hope to influence unions, universities, media, and so on. Every individual who in one or another manner supports the goals of the enemy must be considered a traitor and treated in that manner. Actually, those are quotes from a 1963 military manual provided under the guidance of the Kennedy instructors in the manner of the Nazis. So anyone in the economic, political, and arena, anyone among the popular elements, anyone in the unions, universities, media, and so on, who in any manner supports what the military decides to be the goals of the guerrillas, they can be handled by the Argentine doctrine or the Uruguayan doctrine, and so on. In this morning's New York Times, there's a story, about 20 years too late, but it's nice to have it, about the Argentine doctrine. With a military officer, a naval officer who was involved in implementing the Argentine doctrine, describes how his remorse over his participation in torture, drugging, throwing thousands of people. He didn't do all thousands of them, but he and his colleagues throwing thousands of people out of airplanes and so on. That was the Argentine doctrine, all with U.S. support and enthusiastic support. You might go back and look at some of the comments by Gene Kirkpatrick and others at the time, which weren't quoted. The Times was rather polite about that. Maybe in 20 years we'll learn something about the Colombian doctrine that's going on today. There was indeed a rare official window into that, namely the official report that Juan Pablo mentioned of the Trujillo massacre, and that's kind of worth quoting, I think. It gives you a graphic account of what the Colombian doctrine is. That's our doctrine, remember. That's what we teach people, and we are trained to understand and support and pay. This was a 186 report, that was 186-page report that documented one atrocity, which by some miraculous accident got investigated. This is the massacre in Trujillo back in 1990 under President Gaviria. The report was written by a commission which consisted of members of the government, Colombian government, the army, the police, and a number of human rights groups. The reason it happened was under foreign pressure, mainly OAS, pressure, Organization of American States, and other pressure, which led the Colombian government finally to agree to an official investigation and they concluded what everybody knew and what you can read about at great length in human rights reports, Amnesty International, America's Watch. They're constantly coming out, they're never reported. If you're interested, I have a pretty detailed survey of them in a recent book, but they're quite easily available. And the official report simply reiterates what has long been known and long suppressed. They point out that the Colombian armed forces and national police entered the region where the village is, broadened their scope of action, stepped up their intelligence activities. They managed to get somebody under torture to concede that he'd been associated with the guerrillas, or to say it. You never know what anybody means when they say something under torture for obvious reasons. Gave other names for whatever reason. Then the report says the horror began. People were picked up around the village, detained. Then just after 7 a.m., I'm now quoting the report, Major Urueña, he was the one in charge of the army, and an associate arrived. First they had breakfast. Then the major and several members of the armed group went into the shed where the people were kept and demanded identification cards. A list was drawn up. Then they were taken blindfolded one by one, the first a 59-year-old woman, to another part of the hacienda. A coffee sack was tied over the head of each victim, and he was thrown onto the ground. Then Major Urueña took a water hose, turned at full force on the face of each victim, the mouth and nose, and began to interrogate them. When he finished, the victims were piled one on top of the other, and someone called for the blowtorch and the chainsaw. Each victim was decapitated, cut into pieces with the chainsaw, and left to bleed. The heads and torsos were put into different sacks, and later that night loaded into a blue 1956 Ford truck, gotta get all the details straight, driven down to the river and dumped into the water. That's the quote from the official government report. As to what actually happened, you can add your own imagination. This was one of the participants who was too much for him after a while, and he reported it to the Colombian judicial authorities, an auxiliary to the major. This continued for weeks afterwards, right through the time when the headless body of the parish priest was found. He was the 27th victim, and it went on and on. The testimony was given to the Office of Special Investigations of the Prosecutor General's office. It was then reported in detail by a study of the Peace and Justice Group. That's a church-based, I think Jesuit-based, I think, group in Colombia, which does most of a lot of the human rights publication. Of course, nobody paid attention to that. The person who released the information then went back to visit Trujillo, the town. He was disappeared by a group of armed men in the central square. He hasn't been heard from since. Since there had been publicity, there was a trial, and the army officers in charge, everyone in charge, was acquitted of all charges. That was 1992. But there was continuing international pressure leading to this meeting of the Inter-American Commission of the Organization of American States, which led to the report that you have just heard, which concludes that the Colombian army and police officers were directly responsible for the massacre, and that members of the Colombian government and justice system were to blame for covering it up. That's the conclusion. They recommended that criminal investigations be initiated against the major in charge, but the commission expressed its pessimism, as it put it, that national channels will ever be able to overcome the impunity, and it also records the strong opposition voiced by the commission's government members to the exploration of any kind of international legal mechanisms. Nevertheless, they did recommend that a special prosecutor be formed. The Church Peace and Justice Group, which repeats the report, presents the report, points out that there had been 350 other massacres since the Trujillo massacre, none of them investigated. But they point out that this one is important for one reason, because it gives insight into the moral fiber of former Colombian President Cesar Gaviria, now the head of the Organization of American States, thanks to liberal Democrats here. It also gives insight into the values and principles of the Army, but more interesting to us, I think, the values and principles of those who train and arm and instruct the Army and construct the doctrines in which not only the Colombian Army, but all the others under their influence operate. As for the President, to his credit, President Samper on January 31st did concede that the Colombian government was responsible for this. I think that's a historic first. I don't think anything was ever conceded. Colonel Urueña was removed from active service. That's his punishment. The Army rallied around him and dismissed the Commission's findings and said that nothing further would happen. The Commission was presented to the Organization of American States on February the 7th, the report was, with a an agreement that in 6 months the government must respond. And this Peace and Justice Report ends by saying the country is waiting. How long it waits depends on whether anybody does anything about it here. If nobody does anything about it here, they'll wait forever because nothing will happen, just as nothing has happened in any other case. Well, that's the one case where the government itself described what had happened. Years later, the governments in Brazil and Argentina and not Chile, because the army is still on top there, but in other places, are conceding some of the things that happened under the doctrines that were instituted after this historic 1962 change. So it's good to know that our taxes are being well spent, and recall that's more than half of U.S. military aid going up under Clinton, where under the Latin American cultural environment, the military are forced to act in this fashion. Possibly someday there'll be some questions raised here about the North American cultural environment, but we'll probably wait a long time for that, and if we don't do anything about it, we'll wait forever, and plenty of people will suffer. Well, U.S. advisors were involved in counterinsurgency in Colombia since the early 1960s. Since the Kennedy period. Incidentally, the Kennedy period was bad enough, but it all reached its peak in the Reagan years. The Reaganites were virtually just regarded Kennedy as their symbol. They virtually duplicated Kennedy's policies internationally and even domestically to a large extent. The whole thing just shot out of sight. And that's the reason why the studies that I mentioned about torture and aid were done in 1980. In the years that follows, nobody bothers. It's like proving that 2 and 2 is 4. There's no point undertaking the study. And as I said, it's still going on. The worst human rights violator is also the greatest recipient of U.S. aid. U.S. advisors were involved in counterinsurgency. Colombia had the biggest training program for officers in the 1980s when the situation was really getting horrendous. They had 3 times as many officers trained in the School of the Americas and so on as El Salvador, which wasn't very pretty, as you remember. They also have Israeli instructors, German instructors, and British instructors, not only the army, but also the narco-traffickers, where they are involved in the training of assassins and paramilitary forces, according to the Colombian intelligence, the DAS. And according to Colombian intelligence reports which have been released, the narco-traffickers also have North American instructors, that means U.S. instructors, training assassins and paramilitary forces. That Colombian report has yet to be published here, as far as I know. And if it's been followed up, I haven't heard about it. Published in the mainstream, sort of out in the fringes, it's been reported. Well, without going into this any further, the pretext for all of it, as you know, is the drug war. The drug war was launched, or more accurately relaunched, by George Bush in September 1989 with a lot of hoopla. In August 1989, a month before, the largest shipment of arms was ever authorized under the Foreign Assistance Act. The Foreign Assistance Act has emergency provisions, and the largest shipment of arms ever authorized was sent to the Colombian Army in August 1989. That's right before the drug war. In fact, that was more arms than all the arms sent through 1980, which was plenty. The arms were sent to the Army. They were helicopters, planes, so on. And as was pointed out at the time, and completely obvious at the time, those arms were totally useless for the drug war. About 90 to 95% of whatever was being done about the drug war was being done by the national police, not with bombers and helicopters. But the bombers and the helicopters and so on were useful for something else, and you could see the effects right away in the reports, bombing of villages, massacres, and so on, things of the kind that were the one kind that was reported. They increased rapidly. And in fact, their major effect probably was to strengthen the already existing strong links between the security forces and the narco-traffickers. Security forces, the narco-traffickers, and the landowners are about the same thing. I mean, it's hard to distinguish them, and that's well known. Colombia gets arms from other countries too, or at least theoretically it does. The major source of infantry weapons, machine guns and rocket launchers is Israel, but that's a fraud. That's just U.S. arms. Israel's one of the funnels by which the United States sends arms to its various murderous clients, and Colombia is a case in point. Also Kfir aircraft and so on. Those are all U.S. taxpayer-funded armaments going to our clients. Remember, United States alone provides more than half of all its military aid in Latin America to Colombia when we add the indirect aid that the United States provides through its clients and the other members of the enormous U.S. international terror network, including Britain, Germany, Taiwan, Israel, and so on. The aid to Colombia is quite substantial. There's a lot of talk right now about the omnibus anti-terrorism bill, but you'll notice that there's a kind of an odd omission, namely the center of international terrorism, where the bill happens to be passed, and that one isn't mentioned for some curious reason again. Well, apart from the role in maintaining the system of oppression under democracy and a good climate for U.S. investment, the arms going to Colombia have other needs. The main academic monitor of of arms sales overseas, William Hartung, just published a recent book in which he pointed out that the U.S. arms sales to the third world, including Colombia, satisfy an addiction which is considerably greater than the addiction for drugs, namely the addiction for arms. The United States now has about 3/4 of the market, close to 3/4 of the market for arms sales to the third world, that's a very important fact, because if you look at Pentagon documents or even White House documents, you'll see that there's a reason why we have to maintain the Pentagon at approximately Cold War levels. In fact, it's higher in real terms than under Nixon. The reason is that although superficially it seems that the threat disappeared, namely the Soviet Union, that's not really true. The threat is really the same as always, except now the threat is what is called, I'm quoting, the technological sophistication of third world powers. And to make sure that that threat is real enough so that we have to maintain a big Pentagon budget, we have to make sure that there's plenty of technological sophistication there. So we have to send them advanced armaments. Otherwise, where are they going to get the technological sophistication that we'll have to protect ourselves from? Furthermore, this is all completely explicit and frank. If you read, say, Lockheed propaganda, they say it. Jane's Defense Weekly, the main international military journal, says it straight out, and so does the Pentagon. So, for example, right now, if you want to know what your tax dollars are going for, one of the things they're going for is paying the Lockheed Corporation, which happens to be headquartered in Cobb County, Georgia. It's paying the Lockheed Corporation to upgrade F-16 so they become more lethal. So then we can sell them to third world dictatorships. That's another gift from you, because they're sold on loans from the Export-Import Bank, which is another loan gift from U.S. taxpayers to the Lockheed Corporation. And then that makes it necessary for the Lockheed Corporation to get more money to produce F-22 advanced fighters, which will defend us from the threat of the upgraded F-16s that we're sending them. Cobb County, incidentally, happens to be the district represented by a gentleman named Newt Gingrich, which happens to get more federal subsidies than any suburban county in the country outside of Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington. That's where the Pentagon is, and the Kennedy home of the Florida home of the Kennedy Space Center, another component of the state sector designed by the Kennedy people to supplement the Pentagon ripoff of the taxpayer for the benefit of advanced industry. This all came to a head very neatly and symbolically a couple of days ago. I don't know if you noticed it, but buried in the discussions of the House debate over school lunches was a harassing amendment that the Democrats put in sort of half seriously, only half seriously because they support this whole system as much as the Republicans. But in the debate over school lunches, the question, you know, they're cutting $6 billion roughly from food for poor children. We still don't have half the children in the country starving like in Colombia, but they're trying really hard to get there. It takes some time because a much richer country will make it. So $6 billion cutting off school lunches, and the Democrats put in a half-hearted harassing amendment suggesting that that money be kept and be paid for by delaying, not stopping, but delaying the deployment of F-22s. Well, that one was shot down very unceremoniously because welfare to Newt Gingrich's wealthy constituents has very high priority, and others like them. We all know about that at MIT since we live off that same dole pretty much. But the main purpose of the Pentagon, very self-conscious since the late 40s, has been to maintain the system of high technology industry through these methods, and therefore we got to keep selling arms, since unfortunately there doesn't seem to be any other thing we can do with them at the moment. Nobody much to drop them on right now. So now 75% of the arms market, that's an addiction and a real one. The economy very heavily depends on it. And selling arms to Colombia helps that too. That's another factor that we can add to the Herman insights about the correlation between military aid and torture. Well, I'm not going to review the human rights record. You heard something about it, but just let me end with a couple of comments on the drug war, the completely fraudulent pretext for all of this. It's worth thinking through, has interesting aspects. Colombia became a big player in the drug war in the late 1970s. That's when it started becoming the main producer of cocaine. And why does all this happen? In fact, why do peasants in Latin America even bother producing coca, apart from their own use, which they've done forever? Well, there are reasons for that. They have to do with, again, what's up on that blackboard. There are policies, social and economic policies, imposed on the third world. One of them is that they have to stop producing for their own needs. They have to start producing crops for agro-export. And they have to open their markets, which the Western countries have never done, of course, but never in their history, certainly not us. But they have to open their markets to subsidized U.S. agricultural exports. We don't believe in the free market, remember, so ours are subsidized. Subsidized U.S. agricultural exports will easily undermine domestic production, and since the local farmers are being explained in the proper lessons of economics, they have to become rational producers, which means produce crops for agro-export, and being rational, as indeed they are, they go for the crops that make the most money, and guess what that is? So in fact, coca production has just shot out of sight, and it's part of the basis for the economic miracles. So Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard, who has recently been plying his trade with great success in Poland and Russia, won his fame by setting things in order in Bolivia in 1985. Bolivia was in real trouble, but he moved in with proper free market theory, and pretty soon it was all fine. The macroeconomic statistics were really nice and so on. Various side effects. One of them was that most of the exports, maybe 2/3 or something, were coca, which happened to improve the economy and, of course, caused some other side effects. Well, that's one reason, and there are other things. So, for example, in 1988, the United States compelled the coffee producers to break up the coffee agreement, which had kept prices at some reasonable level, and coffee prices fell 40%. That's Colombia's main export crop, but also way down the region. And when coffee prices drop 40%, and you got half the children starving already, people are likely to turn to something that'll make some money, and there happens to be one thing around. So one major source for the huge increase in the export of coca lies right in the free market policies that are imposed on the third world, but of course never accepted in the rich countries, not in their history and not today. A second reason, which is somewhat narrower, has to do with U.S. drug policies. U.S. drug policies have been designed to try to compel people to drop using soft drugs like marijuana and to turn to hard drugs like coke. That's actually the case. I don't say they thought of this and decided to do it, but that's what the policies are. In fact, it's almost a concomitant of the fact that marijuana is big and bulky and easy to detect, and highly industrialized drugs are harder to detect. Furthermore, there's another, if some of you want to do a research project, somebody around here wants to make sure they never get a job, but wants to study something interesting, you might look into the history of why tobacco is legal, but marijuana is illegal. I mean, tobacco is vastly more lethal and destructive than marijuana. They're not even in the same domain, But tobacco, in fact, is the most lethal substance around. Actually, the second most lethal substance known. The most lethal is sugar, I guess. But tobacco's close second. So why is tobacco illegal but marijuana illegal? Well, I think there's a speculation that comes to mind. The speculation is that marijuana is kind of like solar energy. Marijuana you can grow anywhere. You can grow it in your backyard, it's a weed, grows everywhere. On the other hand, tobacco is an industrial crop. You can make money on it. A lot of inputs, takes a lot of capital and so on. Now, if you have something legal that everybody can do, you're not going to make any profit on it, so you better make it illegal. On the other hand, if there's something that people can make a lot of profit on, especially, agribusiness and pesticides and fertilizer companies and so on, it better be legal so you can get away with it. That's just a speculation. I've never seen a study on the topic, but you might want to look into it. In any event, again, if you don't want a job, that's a qualification. But fact is that marijuana was made illegal, though, and it's probably not good for you, but as far as anybody knows, there hasn't been one recorded overdose, I think, in about 60 million users, as far as I'm aware. But marijuana was essentially made illegal, and a very high percentage of the people now in jail are there because somebody found a marijuana joint in their pocket, quite literally. So Colombia, in fact, shifted from producing marijuana, which is now mostly produced here, to producing cocaine, an industrial drug, and that led to a whole network, peasants in Bolivia sending things up to marijuana to be processed and coming through Mexico, where one of the thugs who was the brother of the president just got picked up. The president fled to Harvard. He's going to be teaching in the Harvard Business School, I think. Not that any of this is any surprise. Everybody knew it who was looking at Mexico. It wasn't in the least bit a secret, except in respectable circles. So that's a second factor. A third question that arises about the drug traffic has to do with its scale. Well, there was a study by the OECD, the Organization of the Rich Countries, just a couple of months ago, and it estimated the profits from the international drug traffic at roughly $500 billion a year, of which they say more than half is received by the United States and circulated through its financial system. Well, that suggests a way to deal with the drug problem. You have a look at the place where more than half the profits are being circulated, like your friendly banker down the street. What about Colombia? Well, according to the OECD report, Colombia gets about $6 billion, which is 2 to 3% of what remains in the United States. I'm quoting now. The big business is therefore in this country, the United States. I'm quoting from a report on this by the Andean Commission of Jurists and the Latin American Association of Human Rights, which was given considerable publicity in the leading newspaper in the country, except it didn't happen to be this country, it was Mexico. The major newspaper in Mexico, Excelsior, government newspaper basically, but freer than the New York Times evidently, published the report of the OECD report, which describes where the drug business is really going on. I haven't yet seen it around here, but maybe in 20 years. What about the bankers, the people who are handling over half of this $500 billion? Well, there actually is a program in the United States which makes that illegal. And indeed, it's occasionally even been implemented. There was something called Operation Greenback that was functioning around the early 80s to try to catch people who were bankers who were handling drug money. It's a pretty easy way to do it. A law was passed requiring that every bank inform the Federal Reserve if it gets deposits of more than $10,000, and with modern computers and stuff, it's pretty easy to monitor the flow of money. Well, it was discovered that a huge sum of money was suddenly coming into Miami banks right after the cocaine racket was beginning to pick up. So the Justice Department went into operation, but the operation was terminated in 1982 by the man who was drug czar under the Reagan administration, a gentleman named George Bush, who decided this didn't look like a good thing to do, and therefore that operation was ended. So we don't know any more about this half trillion dollars that throws through the finance system. However, there were other places which were more easily investigated, like Panama. In Panama, the U.S., right after the drug war was announced, with huge fanfare by George Bush, the U.S. invaded Panama because of those Hispanic narco-traffickers coming down here to shoot up our kids and stuff, led by the arch-fiend Noriega. And what they did was institute in power the narco-traffickers. The bankers were reinstituted. The Attorney General and the Treasury Minister had been directors of the First Inter-Americas Bank, which had been closed by Noriega, incidentally, with applause here. He was then our friend, because it was implicated in drug trafficking. So they came back in after the invasion as Attorney General and Treasury Minister. President Ndara himself and his law firm were up to their necks in it. Panama is now a major player in drugs, maybe twice as much flowing through as before. But again, that's not one of the things you're supposed to be paying attention to. Well, that's part of the drug racket, banking. There's another big part of it. Drugs, high-tech drugs, not marijuana, require chemicals. In 1989, in the 6 months preceding the announcement of the drug war, the Colombian police found 1.5 million gallons of chemicals used for cocaine production, many of them with U.S. corporate logos on them. Well, that's interesting. Particularly interesting because the CIA reported that U.S. exports of such chemicals, in their words, far exceed any legal commercial uses. And the Congressional Research Service, its drug unit, concluded that more than 90% of the chemicals used to make these things come from the United States. So that suggests another way to deal with the narco-trafficking problem were anybody serious in fighting a drug war. Well, what about substance abuse more generally? As I mentioned, there's a much more lethal drug than marijuana. In fact, it's much more lethal than cocaine. That's about 100 times as many recorded deaths here. The former head of the Office of Drug Abuse Policy, Dr. Peter Bourne, pointed out not long ago that the number of Colombians who die every year from substances produced in the United States, with a subsidy, incidentally, and advertised, far exceeds the number of North Americans who die from cocaine. In fact, the same is true here, and cocaine isn't subsidized by the government, although the military that we support is involved in producing and distributing it. And it isn't openly advertised, like they don't have big ads all over the place with whatever the equivalent of a Marlboro Man is or something like that. This is a big story in itself. There's no time to go into it, but it makes the whole narco-trafficking matter look pretty minor in comparison. Well, what about President Gaviria, our friend? As I say, the human rights record got worse, but he did do one thing. He destroyed one of the big cartels, the Medellin cartel, and handed its business over to the other cartel, the Cali cartel. Now, there was an interesting report on this by the same Peace and Justice group a couple of months ago. They pointed, I don't know the details of this, so somebody who knows better can check whether this is accurate, but their report was the following. They said that these two cartels were quite different in their nature. These are the two big cocaine cartels. One of them, the Medellin cartel, was lower class in origin. Pablo Escobar, the big shot, was from the slums somewhere, and most of them were peasants or lower middle class people or workers who sort of made it up through the rackets. And apparently the Medellin cartel, though very brutal and killing a lot of people and so on and so forth, had a kind of a Robin Hoodish character to it. So in fact, it was pretty popular. There was a lot of popular support for it. They were building sports stadiums and kind of like old-fashioned city bosses in the United States. I mean, pretty brutal thugs, but they were kind of nice to people. You know, you came around if your kid was sick and they gave you money and that sort of business, which is one of the reasons they had such popular support. The Cali cartel, and they were wiped out. The Cali cartel is quite different. They're just rich businessmen. They're the guys who are on Wall Street and, in the chemical corporations and all into the things that aren't called rackets, namely just mass robbery of people. And so they were untouched, and now they run the whole thing. And apparently the drug war was very carefully crafted to destroy one cartel, but to build up the other, which seems to have been the effect. Well, that's the drug war. Final comment that ought to be made about it is that the U.S. has tried to help now and then. So in the 1980s, when the cocaine business was really building up, the government of Colombia did approach the United States for assistance in building a radar station, which they could use high-tech radar station, which they could use to detect low-flying planes coming in from other parts of the Andes into Colombia, and therefore stop the drug war. And the Reagan administration was very enthusiastic about this idea, and they did, in fact, construct for them a radar station. It was on San Andres Island, which is as far as you can get in Colombian territory from the place where the planes were flying, but happens to be off the shore of Nicaragua, and therefore could be used as part of the U.S. terrorist war against Nicaragua. So we did help them out with a radar station. In the same years, Costa Rica approached us also with the same request, and the U.S. offered help to them too. Costa Rica, however, turned to British experts for advice and analysis, and the British informed them that the station that the U.S. was planning to build would have been totally useless for any drug purpose, but would have been able to be part of the aerial surveillance over Nicaragua, which was used to guide the U.S.-trained terrorists to attack soft targets there, like health clinics and so on. And so Costa Rica didn't go around with it. So we do help out sometimes. Well, as far as the drug war, these are sort of small facts about the drug war worth bearing in mind. As for the drug war itself, it has a number of purposes. For one thing, it is a straight cover for counterinsurgency and for simply maintaining the oppression under democracy. The Latin American Bureau in Britain described Colombia once as a democracy without people, which is pretty much accurate. So in part, it's the drug war is a cover for all of that. For another thing, it's a cover for our arms production addiction, which is a really serious one. It also has the useful advantage of providing a means to lock up the superfluous population at home. And that's important because there's a major war going on against the general population here, and there's a big effort being made to try to turn the United States into a third world country. And that means with a big superfluous population that there's nothing to do with, we don't yet carry out social cleansing by the security forces, so you got to have other things. And one of the things you do is lock them up, and drugs are primarily used for that purpose. Most of the people in jail are for victimless crimes, and the crimes are carefully crafted. So, for example, very carefully crafted, if you look, take, say, cocaine. The drug of choice in the ghettos happens to be crack. The drug of choice in the rich white suburbs happens to be powder. Possession of powder is a misdemeanor. Nothing happens to you. Possession of crack, you practically get the death penalty for. Well, that's typical class-based legislation, and it explains a good part of what the drug war is about, and it also explains why the prison rate is zooming beyond any other country in the world and expected to go up. Thirdly, the drug war is very useful for frightening the population. People have to be kept from seeing what's happening to them, and there are classic ways of doing this. One way is to get them to be frightened of one another. And the drug war, it's another thing we learned from the Nazis and plenty of others, and the drug war does play that role. I don't know how much it affects the general population because it's hard to test, but you can more easily test how it affects the intellectuals. And there it's extremely effective. So if you want to have an example, you can take a look at the latest issue of the Harvard magazine. That's the fancy magazine that goes around to alumni. And it has a cover story on some guy who's developed some new leadership techniques, which are now considered really hot stuff. They're teaching him in the business school and so on. And he gives an example of his leadership techniques and how much they improve things. And the main example that he gives is George Bush's calling the drug war, which he says Bush made a mistake. He didn't follow his methods. He followed old methods. And the way he describes it is like this. He says when Bush came into office, there was a huge fear and concern about drugs all over the country. And Bush reacted by calling the drug war and going after Noriega to try to stop the drugs. And that didn't work because he didn't follow the right leadership techniques. The only problem with the whole story is the fact when Bush came into office, there was virtually no concern about drugs. In fact, a couple of weeks before the drug war was announced, concern over drugs was one of the lowest things on all the polls. I mean, a lot of concern about the budget and jobs and stuff, but drugs were virtually undetectable. When Bush announced the drug war and the media went into operation, that created the fear about drugs. That's testable. The polls show it. There was a huge media campaign. I actually did a review, just out of curiosity, for the month of September after it was announced. I reviewed the AP wires for a month. And stories on drugs were outnumbered stories on all foreign affairs combined. Everything. It was like half the stories of everything was drugs. It was all over television and so on. And it had its effect. People got scared of drugs. So in fact, the propaganda worked and drugs became a big concern, but a manufactured concern, a concern by the doctrinal system. And at least among intellectuals, the right message was established, namely the one that's the opposite of the easily determined facts, which is not an untypical feature of the intellectual culture, I should say. Finally, last comment, and just a word. The sources of Colombia's tragedy, and it is a tragedy, are not completely external, though for us it's the external causes that are most important. They're internal as well. This century opened with a civil war in Colombia in which an estimated 100,000 people or so were killed. There was a populist leader killed in 1948, replaced shortly after by the first formal fascist to take power after the Second World War, a supporter of Franco, who we supported. But after Gaitan's murder in 48, there was a huge upsurge of violence in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed. The U.S. role begins really primarily with the Kennedy administration and since, and it has been highly significant and remains so. And there also are links to our own society, and they're worth thinking about too. Better than I can express them. They were expressed to me in a letter that I got a couple of days ago from a leading activist, a Colombian activist, a woman who was mentioned earlier, Cecilia Zarate Laon. And I'll just quote from her letter, she's discussing a recent meeting of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, one of the few groups in the world that actually does something about poor people and suffering people and people in trouble and so on, and it has an American branch. They just came out with what they call the Women's Peace and Justice Treaty of the Americas, which is a very good document, in my opinion, and worth reading. I don't expect to see a front-page article about it soon, but you can get hold of it. And she points out that, I'll just quote, "I firmly believe that everything is interrelated, since the real culprit is the economic system, and it is very important that the American people start connecting issues abroad with their own reality, starting with its foreign policy, since things do not happen in a vacuum. I will use an example to make my point, the drug issue. The children of poor women who in Colombia have no opportunities because the society has abandoned them and are forced to be hitmen or to work in the cocaine laboratories to make cocaine, or that are recruited to be members of a death squad team, they are in the same situation as the children of poor women in the United States who are forced to sell cocaine on the corners of the streets or to be lookouts for the salesmen and so on, and for the same reasons. The only difference is that the ones speak Spanish and the others speak English. The tragedy is the same." I think she's quite right, and the tragedy is being heightened in both countries by quite self-conscious social policy. This is going on while we watch, and while so far we do nothing, and if we choose to do nothing, it's not hard to imagine the prospects. Thanks.
Well, perhaps I could begin with, I have a comment and a question. First of all, my comment is there are some people who are doing something about the School of the Americas, which is a major training center at Fort Benning, Georgia, for officers, military people in Latin America. And beginning on this coming March 24th, there's going to be a fast, the beginning of a 7-day fast and lobby to close the School of the Americas, which has been renamed the School of Assassins by the people who are organizing this campaign. March 24th, the beginning of this fast and lobby, is the 15th anniversary of the murder of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador by graduates of the School of the Americas. And in case people are wondering whether this is at all relevant to Colombia, in the most recent newsletter from the people who are putting together this campaign, it mentions that in Colombia, over 100 of the 246 officers cited for war crimes by an International Human Rights Tribunal in 1993 were graduates of the School of the Americas. Our own Congressman Joe Kennedy has introduced legislation to close the School of the Americas, and it has won some support. I believe the past 2 years it's been introduced, and there's growing support for this. And I just want to let people know that this is happening beginning March 24th. I'll put the address and telephone number for anyone who's interested up on the blackboard. My question is specifically about, my understanding is that the guerrilla organizations in opposition in Colombia merged into an above-ground, quote-unquote, legitimate political party called the Patriotic Union, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that was the party that Noam was referring to when he said several thousand members of this now supposedly legitimate political party have been murdered in the past couple of years. I wonder if you could talk about, either of you, both of you could speak about this, what has happened with the guerrilla movements coming together, coming out into the open, and now being subject to a campaign of assassination.
Okay, first of all, the Unión Patriótica, it is true that a lot of the members were people that came out after the deals and the negotiations with the government to become a political party. But it's also true that a lot of the members weren't. They were just people who weren't university teachers or union leaders or community leaders. What I've seen is that definitely the guerrilla members of the different guerrilla groups came out of ideology background on the 1940s after Gaitán was killed in 1948 on April 9th. And it was the true from the most of the guerrilla groups at that time. What I've seen in the last 10 years is that they have no any more political ground. They have no more ideological ground in their work. Most of them have become just criminals, common criminals, doing a lot of crimes, even against the communities. We've seen a lot of kidnappings just for any political reason, but just for getting money. I mean, it's different if you see like when they did get into the embassy of Dominican Republic in the 1980s, and there were all these ambassadors. That was definitely a political move. But then you have seen a lot of crimes, like the one that I told in La Chinita, in Apartado, which have nothing to do with political issues, and that sometimes they're repeating the same thing of non-tolerance against the other group. And yet you see the civilians who are caught up in the middle of this war.
I guess this is sort of a related question. I'm a member of a group called the Labor Party Advocates, which is trying to build the beginnings of a third party for the labor movement in this country. And I wanted to find out some more from you about what the state is of the labor movement, the unions in Colombia, how people can make connections with that, and then also I'd like to hear from Professor Chomsky in terms of what you think the prospects are for such a project making any headway.
Well, in Colombia, with these public court judges and non-faced judges and secret evidence, we've seen a lot of people that it's very easy, because all these trials, to accuse somebody of being terrorist or being narco trafficker. So we've seen a lot of union leaders who are being accused of being terrorists and put in jail without being really able to defend themselves, because this all this secret evidence. Just an example that was in a strike into the communication system. The union went to a strike and they got the country without telephone for a few weeks. And just a few months after the strike, a lot of the leaders from that strike were put in jail, accused of being terrorists. And as I say, without being any possibility of defense themselves. All these courts, non-faced judges and all that, is being used more often and often to persecute just political people who try to become a third party, or people who wants to be in opposition. When they can't do that through trials, they do just kill them, as they did with the Unión Patriótica.
Well, let me begin by a comment about Colombia. I said, and this is really wrong, that there were two parties in Colombia, and then there was one independent party. Actually, there's one party in Colombia, which one of the ex-presidents called two horses with the same owner. And the Patriotic Union Party was the first party in Colombia, and I think the same can be said here. There's one party, there aren't two parties, and it's about time we had a second party. Now, there are several initiatives that I think are important and hopeful. One is Labor Party Advocates, another is New Party. I assume they'll get together sooner or later. They have pretty similar programs, sort of somewhat different, kind of popular base. And the comments that I ended from quoting Cecilia are appropriate in spades here. I mean, the labor movement has always had what it called internationals, but they were never international. It was hard enough to organize nationally. That's not easy. Capital is tyranny. What's called business is just totalitarian tyranny of the most extreme form that humans have ever invented, and it has highly concentrated power. Ordinary people don't have that. They've got to pool their limited resources to get into the game. That's why unions are so hated, because they're a democratizing force. They help ordinary people get together to get into the game altogether, so they have to be destroyed, therefore. The Labor Party Advocates is an attempt to develop a second party which would be based on working people. Working people means almost everybody, remember. And that's a really important initiative, and it has got to be an international. I mean, there is just no way in an increasingly globalized economy for working people to defend themselves at a national level. We see that all over the place. The whole point of things like NAFTA and GATT, one of their major, they're not free trade agreements. These are investor rights agreements designed to place even more power into the hands of private tyrannies. You can see it all the time. Right now there's big strikes going on in Decatur, Illinois, very important strikes. They may destroy the American labor movement. The Caterpillar Corporation and a couple others are trying to destroy the main functioning unions, UAW mainly. I think there'll be some meetings about that around here pretty soon. Well, how can Caterpillar and Decatur, Illinois, which is a working class town, is mostly on strike. How can Caterpillar hope to win? Well, pretty easy, they tell you. They have built up enough excess production. Remember, investment is not primarily for profit, it's for power. And so there's plenty of excess production developed in order to be able to use as a weapon of class warfare. So they've built up excess production in other countries, like, say, Brazil, and they can produce from those countries to try to undercut working people here in case they go on strike. And they say so. So the Gillette Corporation, for example, which happens to be based around here, recently told the business press that they are building up excess capacity, even in countries with much higher wages and better conditions, like Germany. They're building up excess capacity in Germany, so in case workers in Boston get the funny idea of going on strike, they can supply the European and, in fact, the American market from excess productive capacity that they've developed in Germany. Now, you know, unless people across borders can begin to work together the way private tyranny does, they're not going to be able to fight this class war. And it's a vicious class war, there's no doubt about it. So that's going to require political organizations and other kinds of organizations, and it's not going to come out of the existing single party. So it's, unless that party is radically changed by the existence of alternatives which force it to change. So I think this is a really important initiative.
Okay, I'd like to thank you all for coming. Did you want to make a quick question? Okay.
No, is it true that there's a U.S. law that prevents the United States from providing aid to countries engaged in human rights abuses?
Oh yeah, there's, yeah, all of you, yeah, go ahead. Pardon? Yes. Yes. Well, first, yes, there are laws on the books which make it illegal to provide aid to countries involved in systematic human rights abuses. This human rights policy is an extremely interesting one, and indeed it shows what young people can do. This is called the Carter Human Rights Policy, which is a total fraud. It was a more accurate statement would be that it's a congressional human rights policy, which was rammed down the throats of every executive, including Carter, who had a horrendous human rights policy himself. It was rammed down their throats. They were dragged kicking and screaming to force occasionally to follow it. That includes Clinton, by congressional legislation. And if you look back at the congressional legislation, that comes right out of the movements of the 60s, which were mostly young people. A lot of those young people, including some of them who are by now quite high up in the human rights groups and working very effectively when you met in Washington, got into, one of the ways in which they decided to change things was to get into Congress and become legislative assistants. It's sort of an open secret that the only people who think in Congress are the young legislative assistants, mostly women. And they do the thinking and the research and do things, and then the congressmen talk. It's just like anchormen in the newsroom and that sort of thing. Or a lot of scientific papers, if you look. But they pushed through legislation, which finally made it through people like Tom Harkins and others, and it got into law, and it is law. It is against U.S. law to provide assistance to any country that systematically tortures its citizens. Human Rights Watch regularly, when it describes torture, adds a section saying the aid to this country is illegal under U.S. law. The most recent one that they mentioned is the one that gets most of the aid, Israel, which they just put out a report describing what is not a big secret, that Israel systematically tortures people, and pointed out, yeah, all U.S. aid to Israel is illegal. In fact, just about all U.S. aid is illegal, which means everybody who's putting through that aid should be in jail. Because that's a criminal act for a person in an executive position in the United States to carry out criminal acts. So it's all illegal. If the law meant anything, they'd all be in jail. So that's the answer to the first question. As for the, incidentally, the same is true of this Omnibus Terrorism Act that's just being discussed now. If it becomes illegal, if they pass it, as they will, which makes it illegal to provide aid to any foreign entity which is involved in terrorist activity, everyone in the U.S., in the White House is going right to jail, or would if there were any laws. Because most of the aid that they provide goes to the Middle East country, which happens to be more engaged in terrorism than anybody else involved. It's the only country that carries out systematic bombing of defenseless civilian targets, rocketing, kidnapping, just recently blockaded the coast of Lebanon for a month to prevent fishermen from going out. That's terrorism, in fact, international terrorism, and they do it because we give them the money and the support for it and pay the costs and so on. So anybody who gives aid to the Jewish National Fund, or in fact pays their taxes, is instantly guilty under the Omnibus Terrorism Act. But again, though this is transparently obvious, you're going to wait a long time before you read it. We have a disciplined intellectual class who don't see things. You know, you have to be taught very hard, many years, in places like Harvard and MIT, so you don't see what's before your eyes. So yeah, it's all illegal, flatly illegal. Furthermore, the most terrorism, and like I said, it's Washington that's the torture capital of the world, if you trace it back. Well, what about Jennifer Harbury? Jennifer Harbury is another personal friend. There's a woman who is now on a hunger strike again. This is the second long hunger strike. Her husband was she's an American lawyer, in fact, whose husband was a Mayan guerrilla in Guatemala, who was captured by the Guatemalan military, which is maybe the most brutal in the hemisphere. Apparently, Colombia has just surpassed them and taken first prize, but I don't know exactly who really wins. I might mention, incidentally, that the leading killer in Guatemala, General Gramajo, who was responsible for not just things like the Trujillo massacre, but for killing tens of thousands of people in the highlands, he was shipped off to Harvard 2 or 3 years ago to improve his skills because the State Department was planning to have him be their next president. He was their kind of like white-haired boy or whatever you call it. The local activists around here, here's some other things you can do, discovered that he was here. Harvard denied it, but it was true. And Alan Nairn, who's the person who, a very good freelance journalist, who was the guy who exposed the source of the death squads back in the Kennedy planning, in fact. Alan Nairn, working with the Center for Constitutional Rights, Alan has quite a flair, managed to serve General Gramajo with a subpoena at the moment of the Harvard graduation, while all the television cameras were focused on him and he was just getting his diploma. Alan ran up there with a subpoena prepared by the Center for Constitutional Rights, accusing him of human rights violations. There is a U.S. law which makes it possible to sue foreigners resident here for atrocities carried out in the home country. He, of course, fled the country right away. And the case was settled. He was sentenced in absentia to $10 million. Same thing was repeated the next year for an Indonesian general. So there are plenty of things you can do to make the country less hospitable to mass murderers and killers, though unfortunately the ones in Washington remain immune for the moment. Jennifer Harbury is on strike. Her husband was captured, allegedly killed, so the Guatemalan military claim, but she by now has plenty of evidence from people who were in jail with him that he wasn't killed. He's being held and tortured somewhere. And she's been on fasting a couple of weeks ago. She had a month-long fast in Guatemala City, which takes a lot of guts, I should say, to protest this. And there was some move on the part of the State Department and the Guatemalan government saying they were going to do something about it, but of course they didn't, so she started her fast up again. and with enough support, and it's always the same question. If there's enough popular support, there may be an effect, not just for her husband, but for plenty of others who were in a similar situation.
Okay, I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you all who stayed, and thank our two speakers, Juan Pablo Ordonez and Noam Chomsky. Thanks a lot.